and the 40% of you who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you think fixing our workplace can fix our world, I got a real treat for you today. We are talking about early warning signs of financial misconduct. So we have three phenomenal guests here. Let's get a massive emoji explosion, a massive Ethicsverse welcome for Leigha Simonton, Tiffany Eggers, and Christina Gotsis. So we're going to be kind of analyzing this from multiple different angles. Start to kind of recognize how fraud develops inside of our organization so that we're not living in reactionary mode. This next chapter for ethics and compliance is going to be a lot more fun when we could be spending more of our time in that proactive mode, serving as a real strategic lever to our organization. So as we get started, I'm going to run through a couple of quick announcements. Drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat. I was going through some of your follower accounts. You guys are not expanding this network enough. So your network is your net worth. Neither are big enough. Connect with some people today and win yourself a book. We're going to be giving away books as usual. Whether you can always pick any book from the Ethico library. Today, we're featuring the FCPA Survival Guide from our good friend, Tom Fox, the voice of compliance. And if you're here for credits, this is the place to be. If you have not downloaded our benchmark report, you absolutely should. That should be laminated and placed in your shower, on your bedstand, and it's a great coffee table book as well. A lot of great insights in there. If you have not taken a look, I encourage you to do that now as I ramble through our announcements. And if you have not signed up for the biggest and best, these are my words now, biggest and best ethics and compliance event ever, then you need to circle your calendar for July 23rd. Next Thursday, we have Ethicsverse Day again. So we have 4 phenomenal sessions. We have a special guest, which I'm going to share in a second, but we have 4 phenomenal sessions. We're going to be talking about behavioral science. We're going to have an actual AI debate. So a lot of these AI webinars that I've seen, not on the Ethicsverse, by the way, a lot of these other ethics or AI talks, they're very boring. There's no real kind of action in it. So we have the one and only Reed Blackman, author of The Ethical Nightmare Challenge, moderating a debate about AI. So we're going to, it's not going to be the regular glad handing that we're all used to on some of these, webinars. Then we have DOJ Insider Perspectives. And my big surprise, and round of applause for Joa. Joa is he's the absolute man. He's the man behind the curtain. He's the great and powerful Oz. We were able to get Tyson Duva, Assistant Attorney General, who's going to come on for the keynote session, along with a bunch of other DOJ insiders and experts to talk about DOJ perspectives right now, new regulations, and what we can be doing to get out ahead of the curve. And then finally, we're going to be wrapping up the day with session 4 with my great friends at the Great Women in Compliance podcast. If you don't follow that podcast, you absolutely should. Every episode I listen to, it's so insightful, so authentic. Love those folks over there. So we have Sarah Haddon, the one and only Lisa Fine, and my godfather of compliance, Ellen Hunt, to answer all of your questions. So if you have some questions you'd like us to ask, please drop those in the chat and we will be sure to incorporate those. Let me show you a little preview of what's coming on Ethicsverse Day.
The compliance landscape is expanding faster than the universe itself. New risks, new frontiers. At times, it can be overwhelming. But don't lose your orbit. On July 23rd, we're showing you how to navigate the stars. Ethicsverse Day is returning to a computer screen near you. 4 sessions, 13 plus CEUs, and 0 fluff. For session 1, Dan Ariely, Christian Hunt, and Nadej Rochelle will show you how to map the most unpredictable element in the galaxy, human behavior. For session 2, AI experts Reed Blackman, Kay Firth Butterfield, Andrew McBride, Haley Tozeski, and Wendell Wallach debate. Is AI a transformative tool for compliance officers or an unmanaged risk waiting to materialize? For our keynote session, we have Department of Justice insiders Hui Chin, Matt Axelrod, Sean Tonoli, and moderator Matt Kelly to show you how to spot regulatory black holes before your program gets crushed by the pressure. And finally, for session 4, Ellen Hunt, Lisa Fine, and Sarah Haddon. 3 prestigious leaders in the space open the floor to discuss any and all questions you may have. 4 missions, 5 hours, 0 cost. Your launch window is July 23rd. Set your coordinates for Ethico.com and secure your free boarding pass today.
All right, to infinity and beyond. Next Thursday, you don't want to miss it. Invite your friends, invite your neighbors, bring folks on your team. I guarantee you're going to get something phenomenal out of the session. All right, give me a warm emoji explosion for Leigha, for Tiffany, and for Christina. Guys, let's go ahead and just dive right in here. So we're going to be talking today about how fraud and financial irregularities kind of typically develop inside organizations and what some of those early indicators are from a forensic perspective. And we're also going to talk a little bit about how we can better distinguish between, an anomaly that's worth escalating and one that we can sort of pass over. And finally, we're going to get down to the types of records that compliance should be keeping or they should be creating before an investigation begins that can really shape what those outcomes are. So I want to get started with this question. When fraud surfaces publicly, it's usually like a little bit too late to control. Let's talk a little bit about like that period before the enforcement actually takes place. Like, what does that look like? What is the moment that matters most for compliance teams? Maybe we can start with you, Tiffany.
Good morning. So I think that moment before it actually hits the news cycle or the enforcement, I think that it looks like staying in control of the situation, being organized, sort of getting a grasp on what is actually going on. Because once the enforcement aspect starts, things start to go every different direction. So it's sort of trying to figure out what are we looking at now, because the music's going to stop, and when that music stops, it is going to go every direction. So I think that's one of the most important things before it hits the fan, so to speak.
The what hits the fan? Just kidding. Christina? This is a PG, so we get 1 F-bomb per episode, technically. Okay. So Christina, take us home.
Mine for later. I think people imagine enforcement is when you receive the subpoena, but really enforcement starts before that, right? It begins months or even years. It could be an accounting entry that doesn't quite make sense. It could be an issue that was raised from internal audit that sort of just got explained away. And usually by the time regulators come in, there's no smoking gun. It's the accumulation of all of these things that were missed. And like Tiffany said, the period before is about making sure that you are in control, you understand what's happening, and you're controlling the narrative. And I think a piece of that is making sure that you're looping in who needs to be looped in, but also making sure you're not looping in certain people, because you don't want to create documents that wouldn't otherwise exist that may lock you into an early narrative. So I think the period before enforcement looks like having the proper controls to A, flag if there's an issue, B, follow up and follow through on if there is an issue, gather the facts, document them appropriately. And, what you preserve and what you don't preserve is going to affect what can be reconstructed later. And that will not only affect the narrative that may be used against you, but the narrative that you may want to present.
Yeah, it's kind of like a chess match. It's like you have to, you can't be flying through by the seat of your pants. You have to be extremely intentional on how you sort of navigate through it. Leigha, I want to start with you. I was really excited for this panel because I love you all, but you each kind of bring a very different perspective because you sat in different seats, from prosecution to defense to forensic investigation. What does each of your individual vantage points teach, our audience of ethics and compliance professionals on the kinds of things that are often missed? So let's start with you, Leigha, and then we'll go to you, Tiffany.
Yeah. We see what we kind of can reverse engineer on the prosecution side. So I was in the DOJ for 20 years. So was Tiffany. And we were both in criminal. And she did a ton of financial fraud. I handled a lot of appeals and other things relating to financial fraud. And so we saw it after it was over and done. And you have to reconstruct it on the back end more so than a compliance officer would, who catches it more at the front end. But we can see how the scheme has developed. And so that understanding, and how it repeats is very helpful in looking at a specific situation. So when we're contacted about a specific situation that's happening by a compliance officer or by a general counsel, someone who sees something wrong happening or that they suspect is wrong, we kind of know how it might play out. And then we can look at, what areas within the company or outside of the company we need to dig into, knowing that that's kind of where this kind of scheme normally goes. And I also wanted to say, Nick, to your first question, one of the great things about a company being involved and very proactive in discovering potential fraud before regulators get involved is that you can isolate the threat, basically. You can try to isolate the wrongful actor. And like Christina said with the narrative, you can control the narrative. It's not the company who did this. It's one person. And the more you can help and sort of, with your counsel, like all of us, help build out sort of documents and other things that show how the fraud occurred, you're making it, you're creating distance between you and the bad actor so that the company is never seen as the wrongful party. Instead, they're kind of seen as one of the victims in it. And you can go after the wrongful actor and not have it kind of have bad blowback for the company.
That's great. What would you add to that, Tiffany?
So I would add that, all of the major frauds that I handled over the years, the really major ones are the ones where there were all the red flags along the way. The external auditor, they pushed away and the company's just like, oh, okay, no big deal. We'll find another auditor. Well, if somebody had actually taken the time to read why was the external auditor pushing away, why wouldn't they sign off on the SEC filings anymore, they might have been able to stop the bleeding and stop everything that came after, right? And so it would have been better contained. The same thing with when folks that are handling, some of the day-to-day entries, the ones that I've seen that have gone on the longest where people ended up going to prison, and C-suite people ended up going to prison, is they were given emails. They were sent notifications, and either they weren't reading their emails or they weren't taking the people seriously that saw what was happening. I think that those are the things that can change a case from one that it's a regulator coming in saying, oh, there's nothing big to see here. To Leigha's point, they've taken care of it themselves. All's good. Or end of discussion. Versus, okay, we're not even in the civil realm now. We're in the criminal realm, and y'all have allowed this to go on. And the financial markets have been affected, or investors have been affected. Is the ones that I can really think that it didn't have to get that far. So.
Christina, what would you add to that? And what mistakes do you see compliance professionals often make when they discover an issue?
Sure. So I have sort of a unique perspective, having not been on the government side, but also with my financial background as a CPA and a certified fraud examiner, right? And from building compliance programs, we build them by reverse engineering red flags that we've learned from experience have come up in other contexts. And one of the mistakes that businesses often make is the issue that comes up may not be significant, but your response may make it a far bigger problem. And like Tiffany was saying, where if you have different departments or people who sit in different roles getting pings and nobody's really responding or really connecting the dots and there's no open communication, that's where you're leaving yourself exposed. And that's where you're exposing your organization, and you're not going to be able to isolate the problem because nobody is looking at it from a pattern perspective. And having controls where you are conducting risk assessments in the context of your industry, in the context of the environment in which your business operates, and what is normal and what is not normal, and having those regular assessments and having a cross-functional communication line is really what's going to give you the opening to cover yourself and, like we were saying, control the narrative. And a lot of companies don't realize that having an investigation or doing an investigation, the process is just as important. What you're documenting, how you're documenting it, documenting why you're making certain decisions at the time that you're making it. That's really what's going to drive. And Leigha and Tiffany, feel free to jump in. From my perspective, companies rarely get credit for being perfect, but they do get credit for having a process in which they've responded thoughtfully, they've investigated appropriately, they've taken the corrective action, and they've provided the information to regulators in a way that has protected themselves all along. And one of the things that I think companies can do in structuring it is making sure that every decision is being considered. If you are not documenting something because it's unfavorable, that's a risk. If you are looping in more people than need to know, and they are sending these loosey-goosey emails about, oh my God, we're investigating fraud, that's a risk. And not looping in counsel at the right time, I think, is also a bigger risk, because a lot of times companies will sort of contain it and they will try to look at it from a business perspective or try to push it into the background, or like you said, push away external auditors. And it just creates more problems. When you loop in counsel, and then counsel brings in an investigator, you are protecting yourself from the beginning, because you are now operated from a position of privilege. Things that you exchange, work product that comes out of this investigation, you are protecting yourself. Whereas businesses sometimes try to jump the gun and go off on their own and hire an investigator. The investigator does the work, produces work product. Unfortunately, that work product on their own, outside the cover of counsel, is not protected. It is a business record that regulators can get.
That's an important point. And, a lot of what you were talking about related to a comment that was made earlier about controlling the narrative and being able to show that the company itself was a victim. A lot of the, there's all these different pieces that, have kind of been referred to here. You talked about connecting the dots, and there's an external auditor who has pushed away from the company, or there's, emails from, accountants who are entering these records who kind of smell like there is, they smell something stinks or something, I don't find, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe you guys can correct me in the chat. I don't think there's a lot of, that's not usually the first place that a compliance team is looking, the annual report. And whether you're a public company or a private company, there's always great information in there. Talk to me a little bit about how we can sort of overcome this fear of like Gnosticism by kind of looking at some of these financial records, or, this sort of realm of finance where a lot of risk can live. That's where the dollars live. What advice would you give, a compliance team that maybe they're not like suspecting that there's something bad going on, but they don't have that certainty that there's, that there's not something bad going on? Let's start with you, Leigha.
Yeah, that brought to mind a really important point for me to emphasize today, which is that the government looks at data. They look at financial data. That's a lot. I mean, if you don't have an insider who's like doing a whistleblower thing, then the way that they catch fraud is through looking at data that's supplied to the government or out in the public domain. And then they can pull on that string after they see something irregular through, process. But so you should be looking at the data. Compliance officers should be looking at the data and the financial records, and you should have an open line of communication with the people who have that information. Doug, I'll give Doug a shout out in the chat, because he was saying, what do you do if, compliance officers feel hemmed in and that they don't have that clear channel to some of the other C-suite people, or people like the CFO who have the financial data. And I think that's a critical line of communication you have to have, because I know that a lot of compliance programs, they emphasize people reporting wrongdoing or suspected wrongdoing. And that is really huge. That is very important. Whistleblowers can be a giant danger to you if they don't feel like you have responded to them. And so that's when they go outside the company. And that's when, the public or a smart plaintiff's attorney figures it out and the company kind of gets in trouble. But the other thing is you have to be proactively monitoring the data. If you see a financial irregularity, even if it's like an employee's credit card who has a lot of charges that don't really make sense. I mean, you kind of have to get microscopic on some of it. You have to have, you don't have to do it yourself. You can have AI platforms. You can have people who are going through it, red flag indicators through data, but you have to have a line of sight into that data.
And to that point, I think we have a unique opportunity in ethics and compliance, because we are this really specialized risk management function inside the organization. And I find a lot of compliance teams, they myopically sort of frame their function at, let's just talk about their hotline, for example. or their disclosure system or whatever, they myopically frame that as like a compliance tool, when in actuality, it can be easily reframed as an enterprise-wide disclosure tool. This is something that my good friend Ross Ronan talks about when he's setting up programs in new companies. This is an enterprise-wide risk management tool. And we should all be aligned. We can assume reasonableness or we can assume positive intent with other functions throughout the organization. But if we're all pursuing the same mission, we're all aligned and trying to reduce the risk of the organization, then a way to kind of create those lines or create more of those channels is really kind of expanding the scope for the tools that we have in place, whether that's our, disclosure tool, whether that's our hotline, things like that. Because there are high conscientious people, high integrity people throughout the organization. Surprised they don't just work in the compliance department, who don't feel good about wrongdoing that's going on, and reasserting these channels or kind of clearing away some of the overgrowth or whatever it is that are maybe blocking those channels can do a lot to gain access to risks that are happening in the organization. Tiffany, I want to go to you real quick. Prosecutors will say that they can tell within the first couple of minutes of looking at, a document that's been produced, whether the company took an issue seriously or not. Christina, you kind of alluded to this as well. So please weigh in when Tiffany's done. But what are they actually looking at when they make that kind of a judgment? What are some of the clues? Is it just kind of, ethereal pattern recognition, or are there certain things that can kind of tip them off that, that an organization is really just kind of trying to check a box as opposed to putting a good faith effort toward mitigating an issue?
So a couple of things. I mean, obviously it depends on the exact mechanism that's being used for what's caused the issue in the first place, right? But yeah, I would say over the course of my 20 years at the department, the majority of which was handling, financial fraud, both public and private companies that were victimized themselves by insiders and also taken advantage of by outsiders. But it is, there's a number of different things I could look at pretty quickly. And when I would see a repeated pattern over a period of time that was just wholly ignored, that was a big sign to me. And obviously, in the federal government, federal prosecutors have agents that they work with, either task force officers or federal agents, and they bring them to you. They bring you a summary exhibit and shows, look how long it was going on. Here's, basically a timeline showing these are the times the C-suite was notified and nothing was done. And so I can look at one simple sheet of paper and be like, yeah, there's a significant problem here. And here are the SEC filings, and they weren't making the disclosures they needed to. But one thing that you mentioned, and I think it was in the chat as well, is I think so that it doesn't get this overgrowth and compliance ignored, because it is not just the 3, 4, 10, 20 people that are in your compliance department. It is the entire company's, everybody's job. It takes 100%. A village. And so I think that two things help with that. One, making sure that there is an easy route for people to make those notifications, to make sure that when people do make the notifications, hopefully the majority of them, they're going to be nothing burgers. But even if it is a nothing burger, that people feel comfortable in doing it in the first place, because they won't pick up the phone. They don't want to be ostracized, like, hey, I raised my hand and then I sort of got, made the bad guy because I pointed out something I observed. And that's, make it where the whole of the company feels comfortable. But also, I think that there's great education in the compliance department, but there's not necessarily great education for those that aren't in the compliance department to understand. And then some companies do better from what I've seen than others, to make sure everybody understands this is what compliance is doing. This is to make sure we have a healthy company here. And, this is the kind of things, and to make it where everybody feels invested, because it is the whole company's compliance. Responsibility.
Yeah, that's great. What would you add to that, Christina?
Sure. So going off of what Tiffany's saying, it's not enough that you're checking the box. It's not enough that you have control if you have one. It has to actually be working effectively. And what that means is having the control and testing it, making sure that when things are getting reported, they are being escalated. There is a process for escalation and something comes of it. So people need to trust that, A, if they report it, something is going to come of it. At least it's going to be looked into, it's going to be discussed, and the decision is going to be made whether there's going to be additional follow-up or whether it's just going to be closed at the moment. And so there needs to be some clearly defined criteria on to whom these things need to be reported, how they should be reported. There needs to be a follow-up process that employees can trust, that if somebody's looking at this from an external perspective, they're going to be able to see when, why, and how the company made this decision. And you want to document the closure. And what Tiffany was saying in terms of tone at the top. So it's not enough that you have controls in place. You also have to make sure they're operating effectively. But this has to be management's priority in terms of emphasizing that it's not just the compliance department's responsibility, but everybody's responsibility, and providing the training to employees across departments to understand or pick up when something might not be right, when they should report something. And if they have a concern that the person they should be reporting this to is in their direct reporting line, or they're the next in the ladder that they should be escalating this issue to, there should be some clear workaround in order to then escalate that.
I think that's spot on. I think that's really good advice. I want to talk, have you guys ever seen an organization kind of in maybe a pre-enforcement window where they did everything right? Like, what did they look like? What did the way that they, were able to kind of create evidence of intentionality? Like, what were those things that they were doing, and how did that have, an impact or an influence on the outcome they ended up experiencing? Leigha, do you have anything to share on that?
Yeah, we are getting some companies who are doing that, and that is awesome. We love that. We love when they contact us before they've received something from the government, when they've proactively discovered something, and they have usually something has triggered them to get suspicious, compliance officer, GC, someone of that nature, and they start digging, and they get enough to where they're like, yeah, something weird's happening here. Then they call us, and then we help guide them. And then you have really the most options at that point, because then you can think not only about protecting the government from any governmental thing that comes their way later, but proactively thinking about civil litigation against that person, or thinking about referring them to criminal authorities, state or federal, and helping build a case to do that. Like I said, you isolate the threat. You do that by, treating it as something that is a danger to the company and not part of the company. But you do have to have people in the company who can report it to the right people, so that you can start taking those steps in the beginning.
How about you, Tiffany? Anything to add there?
Yeah, so I think Christina sort of mentioned it. I know she mentioned it a few moments ago. I think it is documenting as you go, right? About 6 months ago, I was brought in because of an allegation by a whistleblower, and the company did a great job right out of the blocks, right when that first, arrow came across their bow, and made sure preservations went out, made sure that all the parties that may be potentially involved were notified that there was going to be an investigation, and just documented it very well on that front. And I think because there had, it was a smaller group of folks, there's obviously this unrest. But at the same time, when they're seeing from the top, like you mentioned a moment ago, seeing from the top, like, okay, we're here to help, and this is what we're going to do, everybody felt at ease, right? And it was documented exceptionally well. And guess what? Nothing ever came of it because of that. Whereas if they hadn't documented the steps as soon as they were notified, it could have taken a lot longer to close and take care of the situation. So I think documentation.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of balance this line, right? Because on the one side, Christina mentioned, and we've heard it before, you want to be careful on the documents that you create, because those things can turn into evidence. On the other side, if you're not documenting enough, you're not creating enough of like an evidence chain. I mean, look, somebody's coming into the organization without knowing any of the nuance and any of the context and any of the cultural stuff or any of the personalities that are involved, right? They're coming in sort of, quasi-objectively, let's just say objectively. They're coming in objectively, and they're trying to like get a lay of the land and understand, well, like, is this a pervasive problem? Is this company being cagey? Is this like, is the foundation of this company rotted out? Or is this the natural kind of, I believe you have to kind of assume reasonableness kind of across the board, that the people you're dealing with are reasonable. And I think we all know that, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. Like, we know that that things go wrong inside of businesses, you know what I mean? And so What advice I'd love to kind of go around the horn here, but like, what advice would you give to kind of, to an organization who's trying to kind of strike the quote unquote right balance between not documenting too much that could create sort of, negative consequences for them, and documenting enough to create kind of that full evidence chain, or like enough of a picture to convey that good faith effort to mitigate the issue that's going on. Let's start with you, Tiffany.
So when the problem's first spotted, the documentation there that I'm talking about is making sure everybody, that notification goes out to the appropriate people, that preservation, that, whatever type of business that you're talking about, but that initial notification, because it will calm everybody's nerves, right? One thing that I've seen, and it doesn't go well, to Christina's point, is this constant documentation, sort of like the stream of consciousness, when, the investigation's ongoing and everybody's like, oh, well, we got to have an update every day or something like that. And that is bad documentation. In the federal government, we would always say that when we'd have a significant incident, the first 24 hours, it was a bunch of garbage. You would hear that, and if it was a violent act, you'd hear that there were like 5 shooters, but when you get down to it, there's like 1, right? Because there's a lot of misinformation early on. And so one of the things that I've seen companies do and not do well is thinking they have to document as that stream of consciousness, as that investigation's going on, needlessly. I think deliberately documenting those steps is more important than just documenting to document for document's sake. That's sort of where I've seen it go awry, too much, and not for an actual point.
Okay, that's great. What did you say, Leigha?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here because just piggybacking off of what Tiffany said, that's exactly my view on it. I think every communication that you have or way of documenting you have to think that that's going to be shown to someone someday. That'll be used in a court proceeding. It'll be, produced to the government. And what is that going to look like? And one of the things, so Christine from the chat just said, document the facts, not opinions. You can't get to, I would say, lax in how you document. Don't be informal about it. That's a lot of, I see a lot of email strings where people are pretty informal and they do give these opinions, and these opinions can come back to bite you if the company doesn't, take care of something. So just documenting the facts and doing it in a more formal manner is what I would recommend.
Christina, anything to add there?
Yeah, so Leigha and Tiffany are spot on, and Christine from the chat is also spot on. So, right, you need to create documentation. You need to balance the need for documentation with the right kind of documentation. And like Leigha was saying, you can't be having everybody in the organization speculating about what's actually going on, and all these documents are being created. And you want to separate the facts from the inferences. You don't want to say she lied. You want to say her statement was inconsistent with what we see in this document. And that's really what's going to preserve the narrative and the timing with which you can decide to release this information, whether it be internally and externally. And I would like to say that a company who's doing this process right, and the way in which they can assess the documentation that they're actually creating, is to look at, when you're done creating the documentation, look at it from the perspective of a regulator or opposing counsel, and see if there would be enough information in there to actually provide what happened, why you did a certain thing when it was discovered, and strip out anything that could be an inference, or perhaps rephrase something to be more factual than a conclusion. And I think if you take that view and you go through that process at the end, that's really going to help you preserve that. And one of the things that Leigha said was civil litigation. So not only from civil litigation of the company asserting civil litigation, but the company having civil litigation asserted against it by its constituents, or angry investors who said, you should have known, you should have told us, we didn't know, you had an earnings call and you knew that this was going on in the background, or you didn't tell us that the auditor found this and it was overstated at the end of the year. And I think having that documentation is also important, because it's not only the documentation, but it's what you don't have. So again, looking at it from the perspective of a regulator or opposing counsel, is there something that you should be documenting where if it didn't exist in the record, the other side can fill in with intent about why you didn't have it? And so I think that's just
great advice. I mean, it's such an important habit to be able to kind of step out of the trees to see the broader forest and bring kind of fresh eyes to the documentation, looking at it from that sort of adversarial position, because you can find sometimes you can find some gaps that you might not see when you're in the throes of typing up the documentation. Christina, I want to stay with you here for this question. Like, you talked about building compliance programs, working back from a pattern recognition of red flags that you have seen, right? So like, what do you think are some of the earliest indicators that show up in the financial story, the ones that kind of might precede some of these obvious red flags? Like, what's the recurring patterns that you've seen there?
Sure. So like we said, standing alone, an accounting entry that doesn't seem to make sense, or something that the auditors raised that sort of got explained away, in and of itself does not mean that fraud is happening. But what happens is, over time, if these things are repeated, transactions that fall just below the approval threshold, journal entries with vague explanations, reconciliations that are always delayed, or obvious override of control, and that sort of becomes part of the company's, oh, well, that's just how we do things. That's just part of normal operations. And once you get there, you're now eliminating the ability to see the pattern, which goes back to stepping back from an outside perspective to connect these dots to see if there is a pattern. And once you start looking at those flags in the context of, is the same employee involved? Is this always near quarter end? Is there the same vendor involved? Are controls repeatedly being overridden? Who's repeatedly authorizing that? Once you start to put these flags together, then you can see what the pattern is and properly address them.
Yeah.
I want anything to add?
I'll add something. Nick, I just, what I tell people, because sometimes I think companies have a tendency to think something is not a problem. They try to explain it so that it's okay. No, we expect this, but it's explainable.
And we do that with our kids a lot too, don't we?
We do, exactly. And to assume the opposite. I would just say assume the opposite. If something irregular is happening, I would think, with my knowledge and experience, that something is wrong. Something is really happening. I've told people, if you have a company of more than like yourself and a couple of maybe really trusted people, someone is embezzling from the company. That's sort of the number one fraud that I've seen anyway. And it's shown through the things like Christina just said, in terms of the suspicious looking entries over time. But someone's probably embezzling. Or if you get a whistleblower accusation about something else, sort of assume it's true until you prove it's not true. Now, that doesn't mean go to authorities with it, because if you really can't find any proof and you close the case, of course, that's awesome. But don't assume that it's okay. I would just like really just be an investigator and look at, is it, there might be something here, and I'm very open to that. I also wanted to circle back to something that Lisa in the chat said, because I know Tiffany has very strong opinions on this, and it's going to be really fun to hear them. Lisa asked, can you use AI to help document? Tiffany.
Well, Lisa, it depends what kind of AI you're talking about. And I think even another opinion came out yesterday. I saw a post this morning about it, where they said work product did not cover, protections did not cover it. So there's a lot of, which AI are you using? Is it closed? What's the nature of your business? Because if you're anywhere near the health industry, then you've got HIPAA and everything else that's going on there. Is it open or closed? And I've sat on a number of calls recently, and somebody's like, oh, we definitely want to use AI to document this. I've gotten the AI summary after it, and guess what? It is wrong. That happens. And so is it an actual transcript that's being prepared? There's a lot of, what do you want to accomplish with it? Now, if you're looking at data and using AI, and you're using a system that, that's not the one that's on my iPhone that I do not pay for, there's obviously some benefits. When I first started handling financial fraud cases, literally with the IRS agents and the IRSCI agents and the FBI agents, they were entering all those lines, right? And then they got programs that could pull in the bank records and scrape it into Excel spreadsheets. Now, that can be accomplished through AI. That can be accomplished and quickly spot those red flags. So I think that there's definitely a way to use AI, but it's what are you using and what are you trying to accomplish with it?
And who's checking it? And do they have the expertise to know if it's wrong or not? Or are they even doing it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, like what's actually happening here? Who are you giving it to? Hopefully it's a closed system. But also, you need to have your counsel involved in that discussion, right? There was a case, a guy out of Texas, he did some stuff, and this was a criminal case, did some stuff without his counsel direction, and the court said no attorney-client privilege and no work product privilege. But there's been a number of other cases that have gone on and said, oh, well, these pro se litigants, yeah, there's work product privilege there, or work product protections there. But again, as I just mentioned, there's a case that came out differently. So you need to involve counsel if you're going to start using AI when you're trying to investigate a potential compliance issue.
Yeah.
Back to the point. Please go ahead.
I just want to jump in terms of the use of AI. That not only applies to the organization using AI, but it also applies to everybody within the organization using AI. So if somebody thinks that there's a fraud issue or is committing the fraud themselves, and they are using their own open AI to say, how can I hide a fraud or whatnot, that becomes a risk for the organization as well. It's something that you should be aware of when you are preserving documents and creating documentation about what was asked for, what were employees asked to look at, what were employees asked. Did you use OpenAI at all? Do you regularly use OpenAI at all? I think that's something that organizations need to be aware of generally.
Yeah, and it's so pervasive. People are doing it on their phones. They're not just using Copilot, which has been approved. It's kind of all over the place. In many cases, those things are totally discoverable. Back to what Leigha was saying, though, we have to have that bias to falsify the null hypothesis. We can't just say no news is good news, or we can't have a bias to say, oh, this is probably a fake report or something like that. We have to your point, assume that it is real and try to disprove that it's real. That's a much kind of safer way to, I think, approach it. It's definitely more conservative and definitely reduces the risk of unforeseen, outcomes. And then Jim kind of said something along these same lines. He said, I say it this way: if it were happening, how would we show it? And if it were happening, wouldn't you want to know? Take out the names of the people, any assumptions of good intent, performance, political ramifications, and so forth. So I think that's a great reframe. And I think that kind of posture and that kind of bias is a great way to just kind of reduce risk in general, because there's a bunch of stuff that ends up kind of popping up. I want to open this question, pivoting a little bit. I want to open this question to the panel, and I would love the audience to weigh in as well. We're talking a lot about financial crimes, and we're talking about early indicators of fraud and things like that. Fraud famously, requires what? It requires pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. That's that kind of fraud triangle or whatever. Which of these three do compliance teams actually have the power to influence, in your opinion? Drop that in the chat. And I want to start with you, Leigha. And then we'll go to Tiffany and Christina. Which of the three kind of aspects of the fraud triangle do you think we can best affect, and which levers do we pull to affect those most readily?
I mean, I think to a certain extent, compliance officers can affect all three, but I'm going to focus on opportunity, because I do think, in line with my statement of, and someone made the point, even if you have one or two other people in your company, they can still be embezzling, right? So if there's a company more than one, assume that some wrongdoing will be happening, and think proactively about what tools you can have in place to try and prevent that or try and catch it. And that's where AI can be useful in terms of analyzing financial data. But I think the opportunity is huge. I think a lot of people are very trusting, especially in smaller, we've seen the big companies that have problems. Obviously, the more people you have in a company, the more likely it is that multiple people are embezzling. But we've seen it. I worked on a case with a manager of a veterinary clinic, and she stole so much money from that clinic. And it was just because no one was watching what she was doing. And then there was a case that it's pretty famous. There's a Discovery documentary on it called the Collins Street Bakery case. And it was out of our district, the Northern District of Texas. It was a federal prosecution. And it was someone who was pretty high up in this bakery that did a lot of business. They're known for their fruitcakes. So the documentary is called Fruitcake Fraud, if you ever want to look at it. And over the course of I think it was about 15 years, this guy embezzled millions and millions and millions of dollars and bought all kinds of crazy stuff with it. It's just good. I'm not faulting anyone there, in the company, but it's like you learn lessons every time you see that. And so he clearly had the opportunity and to do that without people catching on, or maybe they were doing the sort of the subconscious explaining away because they liked him, because he was nice. A lot of fraudsters are very nice. A lot of fraudsters come off as really good. So like, that's another reason why when you're investigating something, you have to still assume there could be something there, even if you like that person, or even if the person gives what could be feasible explanations for something.
What would you say, Tiffany?
I would say opportunity. I mean, that's the one thing we can all control, right? The compliance department can control. And Leigha gives the example of the Collins Street Bakery, and that's a great one. If only it was the only one that I can think of on both hands, I can think of cases where it was somebody that everybody adored, everybody liked, but they had basically too much approval authority, right? And so much so that, I mean, they were there every day. So everybody gave them, everybody appreciated what they did. They did a great job. So it looked, but they had been given so much responsibility. And so with that, so much opportunity to commit fraud that was completely unchecked. And multiples that I can think of, it finally got found out when they weren't there one day. And somebody had to go sign off on a payment. They're looking at a bank account. Well, what is this other bank account? Well, I didn't know we had bank accounts at such and such. Or why did they sign off on that? What is this vendor? I mean, this vendor is getting paid $100,000. This doesn't make any sense. I don't even know who this vendor is. So, when it's a department of one, I think that's giving opportunity, a lot of responsibility to someone, but it's also giving somebody with a lot of opportunity. So opportunity is the one that I think could be fixed or, watched.
Influenced.
Influenced most.
Absolutely.
We got a link to the fruitcake fraud in the chat there. Thank you for that, Leigha. What would you say, Christina?
So I have to agree in terms of opportunity, it's number one, and that's really what internal controls is there to address, is if there's any gaps and there's any possible way, even in a company of 2 or 3 people, making sure that in a company that small, everybody has visibility or there is at least some controls, because no organization is impervious to fraud, no matter how big, no matter how small. And if you have an issue and regulators are looking at it, or opposing counsel in the civil context is looking at it, or insurers, I'm going to refer to one of Doug's comments here. If insurers are looking at it, they're going to want to know what controls you had in place prior to the fraud to prevent and to detect this fraud. And so I think opportunity is number one, but I also want to address pressure. And this goes back to something you were saying earlier in terms of tone at the top and culture. If there's a constant pressure, we need to hit this earnings target, we need to make sure that we meet this quota, that contributes to it as well. And if that runs through the whole culture from the top to the bottom, where you have an overzealous manager who wants to make sure that they're number one at the end of the year, I think that is something that can be controlled in terms of checking culture. Take the temperature of your organization. And I don't just mean ask management and ask managers what they think is happening. Ask the people on the ground create a safe space where they feel comfortable enough to actually give candid feedback on how everything is being managed and how that culture is being perceived in the day-to-day and on the line, and not just when it gets up to the CEO or the COO when it comes time to give the earnings report. And something here I just want to refer back to Doug's comment in terms of insurance policies and how directing an investigation can affect your coverage. That's something that an organization should disclose up front. It's something that a good attorney would ask you whether you have insurance coverage, and they would review the policy to figure out whether there's any sort of coverage, and then structure the investigation in a way that would maximize that and be directed in terms of creating your documentation with the policy in mind, so that you are not intentionally, accidentally excluding yourself from coverage by using a particular phrase instead of another.
I just need to pause real quick. I got to read this comment. This is from the one and only Doug. This is a really good session, folks. This one goes into the Hall of Fame. So you guys did not know you were getting into the Ethicsverse Hall of Fame today. You did it. And we're just getting started. Well, we're not just getting started, but we are still rounding third base. So thanks for that, Doug. And thank you guys for this phenomenal session. I want to kind of pivot a little bit and start talking a little bit about signals versus noise, knowing when to escalate, knowing what to escalate. So I think part of the challenge for compliance and finance teams is like, you see anomalies all the time, and we're always trying to bring this materiality lens to things. How do you think a team should sort of distinguish between something that's worth escalating versus ordinary noise, and how do you convey that sort of pattern recognition to the other human sensors on your teams? Let's start with you, Christina.
Sure. So I think one thing organizations and compliance professionals think is that when something comes up, you need to know for sure that there is a problem before you seek help. And that is not always the case. You don't need to know whether fraud is occurring. You don't need to know whether there's an actual problem. But I think if you look at it with the lens of, is this normal in the context of our business operations and the risks that are facing our organization? And if you still feel at the end of that it's normal and it's inconsistent with prior practice, you do not have to go through a whole internal investigation without contacting an attorney, without contacting an investigator, without contacting experts, just to run it by them to say, hey, I think we have this issue. What do you think? And again, I think that adds an additional layer from a prosecutor's perspective of, you did your diligence when something came up in determining whether or not this needed to be escalated. And I think it's better to be safe than sorry. You don't need to have the answer at that moment, but having a procedure to step back and say, okay, is this normal? Is this something we've seen before? And sort of being your little own sleuth or little investigator for a bit in determining whether you should escalate it. I think that's really the step in determining what is noise and what is not. And if it turns out that you thought it was noise and it really was something else, and you documented that you took these steps and you consulted these people and this was the conclusion, you can defend it from a position of reasonableness later on, rather than not having that documentation and letting regulators run amok with it, with whatever they decide to do.
Great. What would you say, Tiffany?
So one thing that I think to help be able to distinguish the noise, I mean, when you're growing up and you play a sport, I play a lot of golf, and what do I try to do to get over and practice? Not enough, but I do try to practice. So I think that a compliance department, and then also bringing in the others that might be outside of it, is to do tabletops, right? Do a tabletop where it is just noise, but have another tabletop where it is actually a significant issue. Because if you practice
Interesting.
And being able to have a couple of tabletops, there's actually companies that can help with this. We've worked on these kinds of things for clients before, but do a couple of tabletops so the people that are going to be hearing that, okay, well, this is what I need to do to figure out if it's just noise easily, how I should document it, and practice, right? So you're practicing having the fire drill before the actual whole entire building is burning down. That's one thing I think would help companies if they do those practice sessions. It is something I think I've talked about before that we had to do within DOJ with a chirp and a chip and all these different kinds of things, so that when that day does come, we all, muscle memory, we knew how to swing that golf club, or we knew what to do and hit the mark well. What
a great idea. Kind of like a nothing burger tabletop is a great way to kind of sort, or kind of to create that sort of muscle memory. What would you say, Leigha?
No, I totally agree. I think the more you can plan out in advance what you will do and talk to others who are in that circle, just have a meeting, and it could be once a year. That's what we used to do in the U.S. Attorney's Office, like Tiffany alluded to, and just talk through scenarios and what you would do. I really am serious, and it's not just because we're in this line of work, but I do think you should have an attorney who specializes in this sort of at the ready, so that you're not scrambling to find one when the time comes, because then it's really stressful, and you're trying to manage this investigation and stop the bleeding in your organization and find someone to figure it out. And it's not like that person might actually be the one handling it. Like, for example, you could have someone who is like in the location that you are. Like you're in Chicago, you could have a Chicago lawyer, but that Chicago lawyer can have connections in Dallas, for example. And so if something ends up where you have to actually take it to authorities in Dallas, that person can already have a line of communication to people in Dallas. And it's one less thing to have to worry about when you're in the midst of sort of a crisis situation.
Sure. And Nick, if I could just jump back in.
Please.
Sure. In terms of these table talks, I think it also enhances culture. So by having these table talks, not only are you working through the noise and potential nothing burgers, but you're actually cultivating an environment in real time where people feel comfortable sharing their thoughts in that space, and management is actively listening. And in terms of having somebody on standby, I mean, when we come to companies who are either under regulatory scrutiny or they were totally slapped by something that they never expected from someone in the organization that they never expected, it is crisis mode. And you need somebody who's a crisis manager, and having somebody looped in who's already understands the company's business and the industry in which they operate and the risks that they've been facing, I think is key. And again, it's not the fact that they're going to be the ones on the ground doing the investigation, but they now have knowledge that they can pass along to a specialist who's going to come in and help. And I think that that is invaluable when you are in a crisis.
I want to talk a little bit about, like, from an enforcement side. Maybe I'll start with you, Tiffany, but like, what separates an organization that caught something early from one that let it run? Is it culture? Is it detection? Is it response? Like, what's the through line or the kind of consistent things that you saw or that you see from that perspective?
I think it's all of the above, right? I think that the ones that I saw that ended up in the worst case scenario for a company, they had a horrible culture. They had a compliance department that's, ready to go, but they were not given, they were given the stiff arm anytime they would try to say something. So there wasn't that ebb and flow, that feeling of like, we're involved, we're part of it. I think that it's, having a program in place and then never using it. Those are the ones that I saw the biggest problems from an enforcement perspective. It's the ones that they were given the notifications. I mentioned the external auditors. They were told by, the folks in the accounting department were seeing something, but they ignored it. Those are the ones, the through line, that combination of those two things, those were the worst case scenarios for companies. The ones that, over the course of my career, there's investigations that I'll never talk about. Because when we started looking at them,
come on.
but they did stuff right. And we're like, they did it right. Yeah, they had a compliance department. They followed the program that was in place. They were listening to the people. They notified, the regulators. And now obviously DOJ has a different, it's slightly different than it had been before. The notification process and giving credit where credit should be due. I think that there's a lot of companies that, they were enforcement side looked at it, but nobody ever hears about it. And that's a great place to find a company.
What would you say, Leigha?
Yeah, I would say, just in really plain terms, the longer it goes on, and God forbid if multiple people end up doing it, some sort of fraud or embezzlement or something even more systemic in the organization, the worse your organization looks. The more it looks like it's the organization at least letting it happen, if not sort of quietly encouraging it. So from a government perspective, it just looks a lot better if you catch it early. And like I said, you make it look like it's someone else doing this and the company's not tolerating it. The company's the victim. One of the things we've talked about on this webcast before, Nick, is the fact that there's a lot of civil enforcement on the government side, and that's against companies. That's normally against companies, not individuals. And they look for something that looks like it's pervasive in the company, like it's something that the company is okay with letting happen or that can benefit the company. And you don't want to be that, because even if you're not going to be even if a CEO is not going to be criminally charged, that company and civil enforcement proceedings will have to pay so much money.
I want to kind of go around the horn with this question, and I think you guys can all answer it from your various different perspectives. But like, how do prosecutors or auditors view a company that's, find something, they escalate it, they investigate it, and they, reasonably conclude it was nothing, and then they turned out to be wrong? Like, how is that viewed? Is that like, hustle mistake, or like, is it negligence? Is it, stupidity? Like, how do you view it? Let's start with you, Christina.
Sure. So I think this just goes back to process, right? So it's not that the company has to be 100% right. It's that they consider the information that they had at that time in the context that they could view it in. And I think that that's important. And I've seen this play out where companies, theoretically did everything right. And unfortunately, the cards just didn't fall the way that they had intended. And I found that prosecutors have been much more sympathetic in trying to work with the company who had already had controls, who had made sure they were effective, who were making sure they were doing enterprise risk assessments. And unfortunately, the conclusion was wrong, but everything worked the way it was supposed to, and the system was in place to flag and detect, prevent, remediate. And so I think it really comes down to process.
What would you say, Tiffany?
I would second that. And I mean, obviously a company can only see what they have visibility into. Whereas, federal authorities, they can do grand jury subpoenas, they can do search warrants, they can see something that a company has no ability. So when it's, when they didn't even have visibility over communications that weren't on their platform that they, don't have agreements to be able to see, I never did fault the company for that. They only could look and see what they could see. And so the fact that the bad actor has other communications on, bank accounts they weren't aware of, things that the company didn't have the ability to know about. I mean, they did all they could. So they don't have grand jury power and search warrant authority. So, you can't fault them for that.
So, okay, what would you say, Leigha?
So I've seen this happen, and I think everything that they've said is correct. I would say the government looks at the process, though, and was the process good? Should it have caught this problem? I've seen an example where there was a whistleblower about something bad that was happening in a company, and it was investigated, but it was closed, and it was pretty obvious it shouldn't have been closed. And then later, the whistleblower went outside the company because, the company was not, had closed the investigation, and it caused the company to spend a lot of money trying to get out of a potential enforcement action.
So, I mean, kind of the through line there is, process and reasonableness of the process. Like, should you reasonably have found it is really what it comes down to. Yes. Man, too bad we are a minute over. Let's get a massive one more emoji explosion for these guys, for Leigha, for Tiffany, and for Christina. How do you like winding up in the Hall of Fame, you guys? How phenomenal. Great job. Thank you guys all you earned it, okay? You earned it. This chat was absolutely blowing up. You guys are welcome back anytime. All of you who are still around, spread the word. Next Thursday, Ethicsverse Day, one for the ages. We will see you there. Love you all. Take care.
Thank you so much.